Welcome to the SmartKeys podcast. We are diving deep today into what is, well, arguably the most critical and complex challenge for modern professionals right now.
Yeah.
Navigating the maze of AI Regulation 2026. And this isn't just about, ticking a box on a rule book. This is about building your essential, immediate playbook for staying competitive in a world just completely powered by model-driven tools.
That's exactly right. The pressure is no longer a future thing. I mean, the time for waiting and watching is definitively over. We're seeing this momentum converging from all sides. You have the EU AI Act setting a global benchmark. You have fast-moving state laws in the U.S. like Colorado and California, and proactive enforcement from federal agencies. So our mission today is really to convert this complex cross-border policy landscape into practical, strategic steps you can take right now.
So are we just looking at compliance, or is this deep dive about something bigger?
It's so much bigger. It's a strategic shift. Look, compliance is table stakes at this point. We need to focus on 3 actionable strategies. First, accurately mapping your highest risk AI systems. Second, drastically accelerating and updating your data governance. And third, building a cross-jurisdiction strategy that actively uses these new rules, things like transparency and safety, as core product differentiators. A tech stack built for this isn't just compliant, it's a profound market advantage.
Okay, let's start with the global picture then, because our sources highlight a very clear and honestly a kind of frightening regulatory arc. Policy moves from these voluntary principles to hard enforceable law incredibly fast.
It's an acceleration cycle, absolutely. Think about the soft law frameworks from places like Singapore, Japan, or the G7's Hiroshima process. They aren't legally binding today, but they establish global norms that get hardwired into law very, very quickly. But for any international business, the real anchor for your entire compliance strategy, without a doubt, is the EU AI Act.
Right, the EU Act. That's the one with the risk-tiered model. For our listener who's maybe juggling a dozen other priorities, can you slow down and really define that crucial difference? Low risk versus high risk in the EU.
Sure. Think of it this way. Low-risk systems are where the potential for harm is minimal. So a generative AI chatbot that writes marketing copy, for those, you're facing light transparency duties. You might just need a simple notice telling the user they're interacting with an AI. But high-risk systems, that's where the potential for significant adverse impact on fundamental rights or safety is very real. We're talking systems used in critical infrastructure, healthcare diagnostics, credit scoring, employment screening. These demand comprehensive controls. Robust data governance, independent testing, and mandatory conformity assessments. It's almost like the CE marking you see on physical products.
That makes sense for European companies, but let's talk about that concept you mentioned, extraterritorial reach. If I'm a U.S. company serving mostly U.S. customers, why is this EU framework relevant to me right now?
Because the Act reaches any AI system whose output is accessible or used by people within the European Union. So if you have an online service, even if your servers are in Seattle, that service has to meet EU-grade controls if a customer in Berlin can use it. You have to build for dual compliance from day one, and this is key. The Act defines 2 separate roles with very distinct legal duties.
Okay, let's nail those down. Provider versus deployer.
A provider is the entity that develops the AI system. They're on the hook for the model documentation, running tests, ensuring data quality, all of that. The deployer is the entity that uses the system in the real world. Think of a bank using a model to vet loan applications. The deployer's duties are all about operational controls, keeping records of how the system is used, and ensuring human oversight. If you sell an AI tool, your contracts now must explicitly map out where provider duties end and deployer duties begin. That is a huge shift in legal contracting.
It sounds like the EU is providing some centralized certainty, even if the rules are strict. How does that contrast with the UK's approach that's often cited as being pretty different?
It is. The UK is favoring a more pragmatic, sector-led approach. They decided against creating one big, monolithic AI law. Instead, they apply these cross-cutting principles, safety, transparency, fairness, through their existing regulators. So the Financial Conduct Authority will enforce AI fairness in finance, the Data Protection Office handles the privacy side, and so on. This means if you're already compliant in your sector, the path might be smoother. But it also creates a different kind of complexity, because now you have to prove your readiness to several different watchdogs.
Okay, let's pivot across the pond to the U.S., where the playbook is, well, significantly messier. Our sources keep calling it a decentralized approach. We're not waiting for one big federal AI law to
And
drop.
it's absolutely correct. The U.S. federal strategy is all about leveraging existing regulatory power. Agencies are moving fast to interpret old laws for this new AI era. The FTC, for instance, is actively going after deceptive claims and bias harms using existing consumer protection laws.
And the FCC just made a major clarification too, didn't they?
They did. A big one. The Federal Communications Commission clarified that the TCPA, that's the law governing robocalls, it applies directly to AI-generated voices. And why this matters is because now AI-generated synthetic voices are considered artificial voices under the existing rule. So a lot of those unsolicited AI calls are just illegal. We don't need a new law for that, just a new interpretation. And you can see a similar pattern with those voluntary safety commitments from the big vendors. They're basically a preview of future regulatory expectations on security testing.
That seems manageable.
Yeah.
But the real urgency and the real headache in the U.S. is coming from the states. We've got two very different models emerging in Colorado and California that require immediate action.
And this divergence is the critical conflict point for the next 18 months. You absolutely must plan for both. Colorado's AI Act is modeled more on the EU's philosophy. It focuses squarely on high-risk systems in areas with consequential impacts: education, healthcare, housing, employment. If your system makes hiring decisions, the key requirement is documentation. Detailed documentation showing how your teams test for discrimination and how you mitigate bias. It's very system-centric.
And then there's California, which always leads on consumer protection, and they're coming at this from the complete opposite direction.
Exactly. California's approach leans heavily toward transparency and consumer rights. They're concerned with the use and the origin of the content and the data. So this covers everything from strict rules on election deepfakes to the right to control your own likeness, all the way to mandatory dataset summaries for models. If you serve California users, you have to get your labeling and your data summaries operational well ahead of the January 1, 2026 deadlines.
So given that divergence Colorado on system risk, California on consumer transparency, what's the single most critical, actionable step a company operating nationwide should take?
You cannot rely on a single approach. It just won't work. You have to build a detailed system-level compliance matrix. You inventory all your AI systems, and then you map exactly which state rules apply to each one, because the definitions for, say, bias or high risk are guaranteed to vary. What satisfies Colorado might not be enough for California's transparency rules. That matrix is your roadmap.
Okay, let's unpack this complexity. If we're building a strategic playbook, what are the key cross-cutting obligations that we can treat as reusable components to save some effort?
The foundation for everything is mandatory transparency. And that touches both the data used to train the model and the content generated by the model. Let's start with data. You need to plan for dataset summaries now. This is more than just listing sources. It means an overview of the content, the IP status of the data, was it licensed or scraped, the presence of personal information, all of it. California is driving this, but the EU requires similar things for high-risk systems.
So teams need to stop seeing the training data as a black box and start seeing it as an auditable liability.
Precisely. And for the content that comes out, authenticity is non-negotiable. Watermarking, digital provenance, clear content labeling. These have to be integrated into your publishing pipelines as a basic layer. And this isn't just a Western thing. China has very strict rules on labeling deep synthesis content.
When we talk about risk mitigation and controls, what are the basics we should be embedding into the design phase of every high-stakes system, regardless of where it's deployed?
Safety by design has to be the mantra. For high-stakes systems, you must embed privacy by design and bias testing by default. They have to be core features, not an afterthought. Beyond that, regulators everywhere demand clear paths for accountability. Mandated human oversight, clear appeal paths for someone who gets an adverse decision, and robust information trails that document every model version, every test, every mitigation step. If you can't show the steps you took to make a system fairer, you just haven't done enough.
That brings us to the concrete readiness playbook. If our listener has, say, 6 to 12 months, how should they prioritize?
3 steps. First, prioritization. Start with that inventory and classification we just talked about. List every system, give it a risk score, and list the applicable rules, EU, Colorado, etc. Second, establish your baseline strategy. Set the US-EU control set as your operational floor. The EU's rules are generally the most stringent, so it's a good starting point. Then, once that foundation is solid, you overlay the specific state requirements, like California's transparency rules.
And for implementation, what are the specific model lifecycle controls they need to be putting in place right now?
You have to implement continuous testing protocols immediately, run red teaming exercises, actively trying to break your system to find safety and security flaws. And critically, you must log those test results meticulously for future audits. That evidence is the difference between passing and failing. The strategic tip that ties all this together is focusing on centralized documentation. Model cards, data lineage reports, change logs, they should all live in one accessible place. It just speeds everything up when the regulators come knocking.
We started by saying compliance is a market advantage. Can you give me a concrete example of how building this kind of resilient stack actually helps you win business?
Absolutely. So imagine two vendors pitching an underwriting tool to a major European bank. Vendor A says their model is fast, vendor B says their model is fast, and they provide a certified model card, full data lineage, log bias testing that meets EU high-risk standards, and an established human appeal path. Who do you think the bank is going to choose?
Vendor B, every time.
Right. Vendor B, even with a higher initial cost, dramatically reduces the bank's regulatory risk. Buyers today are paying a premium for lower risk. Good governance reduces friction and actually speeds up delivery.
And our sources highlight a few specific sectors that are facing immediate, intense scrutiny.
Yes, you need to focus your immediate resources on healthcare, finance, employment, and elections. These areas are completely under the magnifying glass. So for instance, in finance, if you use an AI for loan approvals, you have to test for bias and guarantee a clear, swift appeal path for the consumer. In healthcare, a clinical decision support system must remain supervised by qualified staff, and you have to log those human review points to show you're not over-relying on the machine.
Looking forward, we need to move beyond just measuring effort. What's the next big KPI organization should be reporting up to the board?
It has to be about outcomes. You must define clear, quantifiable KPIs for bias detection, for system robustness, for privacy, and for transparency effectiveness. And these metrics can't just live in the engineering department. They have to be tied directly to board reports, to product approvals, even to executive compensation. That's how you prove real, tangible progress.
That leads perfectly to a final provocative thought for our listeners to chew on.
The path forward is not to view compliance as some hurdle that restricts innovation. It's the essential framework that enables beneficial use. So the question for you, the listener, is this. How can you take these high-level global principles from the OECD or the G7 and translate them into a quantifiable internal checklist? Because that checklist isn't just about avoiding fines. It's the evidence you use to justify funding for governance and to prove real, measurable progress to the entire market.
That is a phenomenal strategic challenge. And acting now, getting that inventory done, building the baseline controls, centralizing documentation, that's the only way to protect your market access and build a tech stack that will thrive.
We've covered a huge amount of ground today, from the EU's risk tiers to the diverging rules in U.S. states. This is a game of preparation, not reaction.
Thank you for tuning in to the SmartKeys podcast. If you found these insights valuable for planning your 2026 strategy, please subscribe for more deep dives on the future of work and business efficiency. For a complete granular look at all the specific deadlines and requirements we talked about, we strongly encourage you to read the full-source article, AI Regulation 2026, Preparing Your Business for New Rules. You can find the link to the article, as always, in the show notes.